Hello, my name is Wayne Beiser, and welcome to a presentation about my journey to memorialize the murdered members of my family and sort of a how-to lecture for others who might wish to do the same. I want to indicate in the beginning that I'm going to try not to use first and last names of people who are not in public position. So for privacy. So I mentioned to a friend of mine that I am going to go to Germany, and he asked for a river cruise, and I said no. And then he looked at me rather curiously, said, then why? And as we think about Germany today, at least many of us in the American Jewish community, some of us think about these beautiful river cruises and the tourism of Germany, and other people immediately think about an era gone by in which some of the worst atrocities that have ever been committed to my people and to all people occurred. That Germany is gone today, and I want to talk to you about that as part of my journey to the Stolpersteine memorials. Included in this presentation will be a brief history of my family genealogy. I'm trying to keep that to a minimum so as not to lose any of those of you that are with us. I'm also going to talk about the Stolperstein project and Mr. Gunter Demnig and his role. I'm going to talk about specifically the Stolpersteins for Philip and Clara Fillenbaum, and I'm going to talk a lot about what I learned, the people I met, along with how to get the job done, a placement of Stolpersteins for your family. The day I gave this presentation last was on May the 2nd, and it, interestingly, was the 27th of Nisan on the Hebrew calendar, and it was Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel and in the United States and in many other countries. Some countries celebrate a different day, typically aligning with the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp or other memorable experiences during their end of the war. Jews tend to choose this date because it represents an uprising, a revolt, a strike back of by the Jewish community against the Nazis. And you will see that there are other examples of that behavior in this talk today. Stolperstein technically means stumbling blocks. In Germany long ago, there was an old anti-Semitic saying when a person accidentally stumbled over a rock in his or her path, an observer might say, a Jew must be buried there. I really didn't know about that until I did research for this, but if you choose to Google it, I'm sure you'll find it. Mr. Demnig chose the name stumbling block or Stolperstein for that reason. And also for a second reason, that a passerby might stumble upon them unexpectedly rather than stumble over them and fall. Mr. Demnig additionally quotes a Talmud expression that a man is not forgotten until his name is forgotten. This is a photograph of the Horn family home, and this branch of my family is the Horn family, and they lived in a very small farm village, about 20 miles or less from Cologne. The village is on a little bit of an incline or a little bit of a rise in what appears to be the Rhine River Valley. And so this is a photograph of my great-great-grandmother and grandfather, Moses and Clara. Her maiden name was Katz, last name Horn, and tombstones that represent their passing. These tombstones are set in a very small graveyard up on the hill above the little village of Walberberg, and we will talk about them later. Please excuse the University of Kentucky hat. I am a University of Kentucky fan. I was walking down the street in Cologne and saw, of all things, a University of Kentucky hat in the window of a store. There's no way I could not buy it. There's a very exciting website that you may want to consider writing down, and you see it indicated above. And this is a website that has an incredible number of families of German origin, mainly Jewish, but I'm sure many that aren't. And you need a little bit of information in order to access it, like the first name and the last name and some kind of a date, birth date, death date, wedding date, some kind of an event so that they can help you to trace it down. This is a family tree representation of my great-great-grandfather Moses Horn and his wife Clara Katz, and it goes back to the 1700s. These people were born in Germany going back hundreds of years. They were citizens of Germany, and the plight that befell their children is the reason for this talk. I was in Germany and in that small village some years ago with the 3 other members of my family. And during that visit to Valberberg, I had the distinct pleasure of meeting the gentleman on the far right. His name was Herr Nun, and Herr Nun had been a child at a time when my great-great-grandfather was still alive. He told me a couple of interesting stories, one of which was that on the occasion of one of the Gentile holidays, that my great-great-grandfather would decorate a cow with flowers on the top of its head and walk it through the streets of Valberberg. And then on that holiday, the cow would be sacrificed and the meat would be shared with all the members of the village. He additionally told me a story of how my great-great-grandfather would tease him when he was a young boy entering puberty, when his voice would be cracking, and my great-great-grandfather would crow like a rooster to imitate the abnormality in his voice. So my great-great-grandparents lost 2 of their children, 1 daughter-in-law, 4 grandchildren, and the spouses of 2 of those grandchildren. The names in red represent the members of my family that were lost, and we'll talk about some of them briefly. This is a photograph of Bertha and Lena Horn. They were 2 elderly sisters that never married and were living in Valberberg at the time that we're talking. I did learn the story that on the night of Kristallnacht or Pogromnacht, they were tormented, the windows were broken to their home, and everything was done to disrupt their lives that could be. Even after that, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen a letter of protest that my great-great-aunts wrote to whoever was in charge of that little tiny cemetery, where they protested a Nazi rule that forbid the burying of Jews in German soil. These people protested, saying that they owned that land, they had bought that land, and by what right did the government have to refuse to allow them to be buried there? I think that's a rather courageous thing for 2 ladies to do in 1939. You can see the date of March 26 up above. Another group of relatives, the brothers Herman and Gustav Horn. Now I have 2 Horn relatives named Gustav, and I'll try to reference them as the older or the younger. This one is the older of the 2. The older of the 2 brothers. Standing is Herman Horn, and you can see by the enlarged photo on the right, Herman Horn was a decorated war hero from World War I, where he sustained a leg wound and won the Iron Cross second class. I've had that ribbon verified by the German army that is, in fact, what that ribbon represents. He walked with a limp the rest of his life. He did, however, perish in Theresienstadt concentration camp in 1944, just a few months before its liberation, and miraculously his wife survived. Sitting is his younger brother, Gustav, and here's a photograph of Gustav on the far left with his wife, who was not Jewish, and their daughter, Inga. On the right, you'll see Inga's Nazi documentation card, and on the other side of it has a great big J for Jew. Inga tells the story of how by the time she did manage to get to the United States after the war, she had moved 21 times in her short life. She later was married and had children, and I'll show you that later. This is a photograph more relevant to where our topic today is going to be. On the left, you see Clara Katz with her brother Gustav, the younger of the two, and their youngest sister Ruth. In the photograph on the right, we see Clara in the hat, and we see her husband Philip. And it's for them that this placement of Stolpersteines was being made. Next to them is the little girl that you see in the picture, Ruth, and her husband, Zvi. Their story of survival underground in Holland under the German government during the war is a harrowing experience and includes a portion of time when she worked as a clerk typist for the German army, and every day went to work surrounded by Nazis and as a Jewish young lady. So we went back to the little village of Valberberg, and we'll talk about that again a little later. And here you see this nice modern home, which is placed in the exact spot where our family home used to stand. And if you look on the driveway in front of the home, you'll see some irregularity in the pavement stones. To the right, you see what that irregularity is. These small blocks are usually very shiny, and I think with time has worn them down a little bit, and each of them is a memorial to one of those great aunts that I showed you a photograph earlier. Bertha and Lena were taken from their homes. They were transported eventually to Theresienstadt, and this document indicates that they died in the Treblinka concentration camp. We have other evidence that suggests they may have died elsewhere, but all the evidence is that these elderly ladies were murdered by the Germans during that time of war. And here's a close-up of those two Stolpersteins. And this is Gunter Demnig in a photograph of a few years ago. And he refers to the Stolpersteins as a statement of here lived. He began this project in the early 1990s, and he actually did it without permission. Now permission has been granted, I guess, in all the countries of Europe. There have been over 77,000 of these stones placed throughout Europe, making it the largest art exhibit anywhere in the world. And he is an artist and considers it part of his profession. It's in 23 different countries and over 1,200 towns and villages. And they represent not only Jews, but Romani, Gypsies, Jehovah's Witnesses, gays, and other victims of the state. These people were either murdered or they were forced to flee, and the effort is to try to place these blocks in front of the last freely chosen residents of these people. If you'd like to learn more, one of the resources I'm going to speak to you about again later is this one above, and I think you might want to write that down. It's in different languages, and I think it will help you to access a Stolperstein placement, and there's a lot more to talk about that. So Clara and Philip fled to Holland in December of 1938. They married in Amsterdam in March of 39. In 1942, they were deported to a Westerbork transit camp, from which they then were sent to Auschwitz and perished. Approximately 97,000 Jews in a total of 66 trains were sent from Westerbork to Auschwitz, including Anne Frank on August the 4th of 1944. At the time they were murdered, these two folks were 34 and 33 years of age. This is a online photograph, a Google photograph of the a model of the Westerbork transit camp. And here is a picture of the overall layout of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp area. I'm not going to burden people with a great deal with any of the tortuous photographs that we're all familiar with representing the Holocaust. Each of these rectangles is a barracks, and each of these barracks is a very long building, and the buildings are have bunk beds, if you want to call them beds, slabs really, on each side of a common hallway going up to the ceiling, 3 and 4 high. Also, having Stolpersteins placed for them are Isaac, Hinda, and Sunil Phillenbaum. They represent Philip's father and his mother and his older brother. These people were taken and they were sent to Poland in an event called the Poland Action, which I really didn't know much about. But it turns out that Germany was making an effort in the pre-war era of 1938 to remove its non-native Jews from the country. And at that time, Poland, seeing this happen and recognizing that there are tens of thousands of these people residing in Germany, decided they didn't want to let them come back and required that each person have a special stamp on their passport if they were Polish nationals now living in a foreign country. But the office wasn't open very often. It was very difficult to get the stamps. And finally, Germany put them in cattle cars and sent them off to the border and just dumped them at the border. Sunil, the brother of Philip, the brother of Philip, managed to flee to Belgium, where he was later arrested and murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. It turns out that one of the people that was part of this Poland action sent a postcard to her brother, who was living in Paris at the time, and this young man, Herschel Grinspan, so enraged, assassinated Ernst von Rath on November the 7th. Kristallnacht, or the burning of all of the synagogues throughout Germany and the ransacking of Jewish businesses and the beating of Jews in the street, occurred on the night of November 9th and the day of November the 10th, immediately following that action. The day the Warsaw Ghetto began, 13,000 Jews fought back and by and large mostly died. The total cost of the war defies imagination. We know the common number of 60 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, but it represents about 60% of the 1939 European Jewish population. Beyond that, 70 to 85 million people, or 3% of the world's population, died during that war. I think that most of them were civilian casualties, more so than the military. These numbers are up for debate. The numbers I received and I'm using in this presentation indicate that Russia lost 20 to 27 million people, China somewhere between 15 and 20 million, though I have seen much higher numbers, Germany 7 to 7.5 million, Poland 6 million, of which 3 million were Jews, Japan 2.5 to 3 million, and the United States lost 400,000. This is Gunther Demnig, more recently, at the placement of the Stolpersteins for my family. He placed 77 of these memorials in just 2 days. He has assistants that help him with the process, and from what I understand, he's fully booked through most of 2020. The cost of a block is 120 euros, but in all of the cases of my relatives, and I think in most cases, these expenses have been paid by private citizens, schools, churches, and other organizations, and Jews have rarely had to pay for the Stolperstein. Permission is needed in Germany only if the memorial is to be placed on private property. Otherwise, it can be placed in the public domain without any particular authorization. And this was the placement of our Stolpersteins on March 18, 2019 at 10:30 in the morning at Neugrosse Strasse 38. And here you can see on the left, the preparation of the site. Many of the roads and sidewalks are cobblestones in this area of Germany, and it It's not unreasonably difficult to remove those stones. And here you can see where they have been permanently placed into the pavement. This is our ceremony, if you want to call it that, on that morning. We talked. We said the Hebrew prayer for the dead. And we got to know each other a little bit on that morning, and I'd like to tell you about these people. The ladies on the far end were kind enough to come to our memorial service, although theirs was actually for the next day. This is a photograph of my relatives and myself. I'm that guy over in the far right in the copper-colored coat, looking like he's freezing to death. So the gentleman with the gray overcoat on is a representative of the local synagogue and not my relative, but it certainly is my friend. As you can see, he's holding my hand. It was emotional, and I appreciate his support. This one of the ladies in attendance was Andrea. And Andrea's from a small town. She came forward sometime previously with emails to me that she wanted to know if she could sponsor the placement of a Stolperstein. She reached out to me because we had previously done one of these memorials in front of her sister's house, and feeling a sense of obligation, wanted to know if there were any Jews from her little town that had died or fled. Interestingly enough, we could not find evidence that any Jews had died or fled from this little village, and so that effort went unfulfilled. I want to talk to you about this wonderful family, the Conradi family. When I asked them what brought them here today and why they did that, they explained that this presentation of this memorial was a gift, a Christmas gift that their children had given to them, their daughter and son-in-law. Now, I don't know, I mean, I'm Jewish, I never had a Christmas gift, but I imagine that for a non-Jewish family, a Christian family, a Christmas gift was an important event. And it just touches me that the daughter and son-in-law would recognize the importance of this and feel motivated to do such a contribution, such a gift, and that the parents would welcome it as they have. I did send an email of thank you to the family, and what I got in return was also very heartwarming to me. He wrote, after what has happened to Sunil, again, that's the brother of Philip, and the others, what people of our town, of our country, was able to do to their neighbors, it is us to say thank you for showing up. Thank you for praying. Thank you for talking to us. Never again. That was the slogan I grew up with. So I wish and hope that this will still apply today and the future. I chose not to correct any flaws in any of the English that I've just read or I'm going to read to you. So I think it makes it even more genuine because these are their words. He went on to say, regarding individual and collective guilt, your comment on guilt reminds me on discussions we had at home when we were children. My sister said, we didn't do that, so stop talking about it. But the argument that convinces me most until today is that we have a kind of inherited guilt or original sin, like all mankind has of from Adam and Eve, as we believe. For it is not the question of personal guilt, but of taking responsibility which cannot be denied or get rid of. The only question is how you deal with it, how you react on it. And that indeed is the personal responsibility that might lead to personal guilt if you act wrong, unhuman. It's the concept of individual and collective guilt that touched me so sincerely. This is note from the Swerthheim family, again, a Christmas gift from his son and daughter-in-law. The encounter with you and your family from the USA and from Israel was the second great gift. Only this encounter really brought me near the murdered person for whose memorial stone I had taken the sponsorship. From the awareness that in Germany between 1933 and 1945, crimes against humanity in unimaginable extent have taken place, which must not happen anymore. I could feel human closeness and empathy for the personal suffering. In addition, I also felt in the brief moments that I was able to get to know very nice and lovable people. And then there's this family, a young, newly married couple. For us, it was an emotional experience as well, as there are some parallels between the life of Clara and Philip and ours. As fresh bride and groom, we were moved deeply by the fact that life was so dramatically different for Clara and Philip when they were around our age. In our opinion, the Stolperstein movement is a great way of never forgetting the horrors of Nazi dictatorship in everyday life. It is horrifying how many Stolpersteins you see in everyday life. Always remember that, always a reminder and warning sign to speak out and act against any form of intolerance. We are more than happy that we could contribute a short piece to this wonderful project and to your families. Always remember that you have a young couple in Cologne who watches for the Stolperstein and the memory of your relatives. We will tell their story to our friends, relatives, and someday our kids. Another gentleman who was with us this morning is Igor. I think my photograph doesn't do justice to his head. It's a panorama shot, and he was right in the middle, or I moved slightly. But Igor is associated with the Rundstrasse Synagogue, and here you see a photograph of the rebuilt synagogue. It was partially destroyed during the war, and it is just around the block from where the parents of Clara Fillenbaum lived, Clara Horn Fillenbaum. This synagogue is a very beautiful synagogue, and I had the pleasure of attending services there on the Sabbath preceding the placement of these stones. And to the left, you see Ute. I'm not going to give her last name, but she works with the synagogue. She's been quite a friend and email correspondent with me over the years in trying to arrange many of the previous Stolpersteins and this one. And I put this slide on the right into my presentation because it discusses the presence of Jews in Cologne and the history of that timeline from the year 321, when the Jewish community is first mentioned in a letter from Emperor Constantine to the city council of Cologne. It also chronicles times in which the Jews had been expelled or murdered and then allowed back and then expelled or murdered again and again. And it's a very fascinating and harrowing timeline to observe. Pope Benedict visited that very synagogue in August of 2015. It's the second visit ever by a pope to a Jewish synagogue. Just for brevity, I'll go to the last paragraph. The Catholic Church is committed, and I affirm this again today, to tolerance, respect, friendship, and peace between all people, cultures, and religions. The visit, punctuated by the ancient call of the shofar, the ram's horn, was fraught with history. A German who had taken part unwillingly in the Hitler use as a boy, becoming only the second pope to visit a synagogue. So if you take a left when you get out of the synagogue and you go to the very first block and you take another left, you'll be on Beethovenstrasse, and my relatives Jacob and Rosalia Horn lived on this street in what I think is that brown building that you see on the left. And here they are sitting with some of their family in Israel, where they were able to finally settle and join the family kibbutz Hazarea, which is not too far from Haifa. And when I started my work on the Stolperstein placements, I was directed to a gentleman, Ibrahim Balsalam. And I'm going to stop here and dwell for just a minute about my own personal reaction and insight. And my initial thought when I saw an Arabic name representing in the office that was going to help me to go forward with the placement of the Stolpersteins, I have to say that the prejudice within me jumped up. And I also am proud to say that the brain overrode my gut reaction, and I had an opportunity to meet and work with one of the nicest, sweetest people you'll ever want to know. Ibrahim assisted with the Stolperstein placements, with every one of the placements in the city. He goes over interminable numbers of details, and I can't tell you all the other things he does as part of his job at the NS Documentation Center. Ibrahim is my friend, and I look forward to seeing him again someday. And interestingly enough, he told me in a conversation that his father was Muslim, his mother was Christian, and he lives as a Christian. Not that that matters, but I do point it out, and maybe that's a problem too. Other placements in the city of Cologne, or in the area of Cologne that day, included this one in front of this school. And here you see an article in the paper about children singing at the placement of additional Stolpersteins. This makes quite a bit of publicity in the city when these occur, and I think that that's important too. Then I'm going to introduce you to Dr. B. Becker. This lady is my friend in capital letters with exclamation points. She's a recently retired director of the Jewish Documentation section of the NS Documentation Center in Cologne, the National Socialist or Nazi. And this documentation center is a museum and an outreach. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Dr. Becker is a PhD in history. She's authored 5 books on the Jewish history of Cologne, which is absolutely incredible books. They're in German, but from my little bit of German about the level of a 2-year-old, I could get an appreciation for what she has done. Also, the pictures helped a lot. She also wrote one fiction that's totally unrelated, and she's terribly embarrassed that when you Google her, you come up with the fiction story, and rather than her 5 important documents that she has created. She is my friend, and she was our personal guide during our trip, and here you see her signing my book and books for my relatives. And this is one of the 5 books, and it's about the Jewish cemetery in Cologne known as Baklamund. There's a Gentile Baklamund and a Jewish Baklamund, and they're very close to each other. This is an example of what she's done in one of her books, and she's acquired information on the people that are buried in this cemetery. Now, again, most of these burials were done before the Nazi era became what it became. And she's established biographies on them, complete with photographs. And you can see the one on the left, the guy was an athlete. And you can see on the right, the guy must have been, or lady, whoever, must have been a circus act. I mean, just quite in detail stories. She's also written about the Jewish hospital in Cologne and another about remembrances of Cologne. And here is the NS Documentation Center. Interestingly enough, most cities in Germany are now required to have some kind of an archival resource. This is the archival resource for Cologne, and it is housed in what was Gestapo headquarters. On the left was a very haunting painting as you enter the building, and I think it says just about everything there is to be said. And on the right, this is a newspaper from the time of the opening of the documentation center in Cologne, and one of the headlines at the bottom says, "I ask who knew us." This was written by a prisoner. Here I am in the basement of the building, and as you can see, they've done everything they can do to keep from changing the appearance of the building from the way it was at the time that it was Nazi Gestapo headquarters. It's quite harrowing, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but I found it so important that I knew I had to share it with everyone. There's a courtyard, and you exit the courtyard not knowing exactly what's going on out there, other than there is a sign that says this is where firing squads took place. And when you walk out, you'll notice that all four sides are mirrored. So what you see is yourself. And perhaps you can project that you're the one standing against the wall in Gestapo headquarters. A comparison. On the left is a poster of the organization and a few pictures of the Hitler Youth. And today there's a children's museum on the uppermost floor. And you'll notice that all of the details, basically items you might find at home, are hanging from the ceiling. They're upside down. And the realization that this was a world in which everything was upside down. Bad was good. They do outreach. Children's school groups come to the documentation center. And I think that this is a very, very important part of passing on the lesson. This is the most horrible photograph of them all, in my feelings. Here you see a 4-year-old kid dressed up in a German soldier's uniform. The man you assume is the father. It looks like he's fairly proud of this event, and the kid has virtually no understanding of what's going on. He's holding his hand, and it appears that he wishes to pass on the values that have made him put on that uniform to his son. Of all the photographs, the idea of passing that hate to the next generation is the most ugly of them all. Lastly, on this section, it says, the hours last like years, and this room knows only sighs. Laughter gives way to this sorrow. The sun does not shine here anymore. When will this torment come to an end? This was written by a prisoner on the walls, and this is the plaque that's been put up to memorialize it. While we were at the NS Documentation Center, we were amazingly given 5 letters from Gustav the Elder, Horn, to his wife and daughter Inga that he had written just before he was murdered. And I can't read the German. The English is available, and the picture to the right shows Inga with her 3 daughters. And as my understanding, they have these letters, and they have the translations now of their grandfather's letters to their grandmother and their mother. So we went for a little trip, and there's Dr. B and my cousin Iris. And we're on the subway, and we go out to the Bucklemon Jewish Cemetery, and we found the graves of 2 of my relatives who had become deceased before the Holocaust. And one of the 4, Fanny Horn, geborn Hertz, maiden name Hertz, died at Theresienstadt. And we've heard a lot of stuff about Jews that didn't serve in the army. Here's a memorial to the fallen from Cologne, and you can see from this memorial, which is not unlike the memorial to Vietnam Memorial in Washington, all the names of all these people, Jewish people who died in World War I on the side of Germany. Then we went to Walberberg, the village it's now part of a larger city named Bornheim. We went to the cemetery, and you can see almost all the gravestones right there. And you can see that it's up on a little bit of a hill. When I was there in 1988, none of these other homes were there to the best of my recollection. It was kind of like a deserted area. Now there's nice modern homes all over the place. And you can see the vapors coming up from the city of Cologne far off in the distance. This is the mayor of the city of Bornheim, who was kind enough to come out to meet us. A very fine gentleman, and he couldn't ask for a more courteous person. He took us on a short walk from the cemetery down to a recreation center, and along the way, we met this gentleman in the dark vest standing next to me. This gentleman, whose last name I won't give because he's not a city official or an official person, was very kind. He says he remembers my two aunts who perished, Bertha and Lena. And when I asked him about the Kristallnacht, he did tell me at that point that he was about 6 or 8 years old, and he remembers hearing them shouting and screaming for help as they were being tormented and beaten. And as a kid, he couldn't do anything. And the adults of the community were totally frightened to death about doing something either. They would have gotten the same. We moved on to the community center in this little village, and it is dedicated to the Geschwister Scholl house building. And it turns out that the building is dedicated to Hans Scholl and Sophie Scholl. These two college students at the University of Munich were part of an organization called the White Rose, which was a resistance group to the Nazis. And they handed out flyers, and they mailed flyers to other cities, and did what they felt they could do in protest to what was going on in Germany during the war. Unfortunately, they were all caught and they were all killed. They're just one of several resistance groups I hope to talk to you about shortly. So before we arrived, I received an email from my good friend Jens Loeffler over on the right, first gentleman coming over from the right with the green sweater on. Jens is the archivist for the city of Bornheim, of which Walbeberg is part. And Jens asked me if we would be willing to meet with a group of school students. Well, I thought that suddenly became very important, because not only would our trip allow us to memorialize the past, but perhaps have some minimal little voice on somebody's feelings in the future. So we did, and this too was a very memorable experience. The sisters told us about, the girls told us, the students told us about a video that they had made last year as part of a student video contest. The title required everyone address the title of My Terrible Sister, and that it could only be 5 minutes long. And then they showed us their video from last year, and the video was in German, but it didn't take being able to speak German to see two young girls frolicking, hiking through the woods, having a great time, an older sister and a younger sister. And as they're going about their youthful fun, they come across a swastika on a wall and do their best to remove the swastika. And then, shortly thereafter, you see the two girls going down a rather dark road, and the older sister opens up her pocketbook as a gentleman comes out of the shadows in a long coat, sinister looking, and accepts all of her money. And he takes the younger sister away, screaming, for her older sister to come with her. So what this represented was the older sister sacrificing everything she had to save her younger sister, knowing that there was no salvation for her, that she would not be saved. Both of them knowing it. It was a powerful emotional experience, even without being able to speak German. We had sat with them for maybe an hour, hour and a half, and answered all of their questions before we saw the video, and what they're going to do with the answers that we provided them is allow them to use that information in the making of the next video for this year. By the way, their version of My Terrible Sister was the number one winner in the contest. And lo and behold, very shortly afterwards, Jens sends me the photograph on the left. He hasn't found the statue, but he has this photograph. And it reads, down at the bottom you can see there's an inscription, and he translated it for me exactly as he could. The Jew Moses from Valbeberg, around 1900, dressed with a flat black hat called Matzi, named after the flat Pesach bread and tailcoat. He leads the decorated fat Pentecost bull through the village. The animal was slaughtered in a barn, and the meat was used to cook sauerbraten, marinated pot roast, which was eaten together with red cabbage in every household at Pentecost. It's like getting a postcard from my great-great-grandfather, and is one of the most shaking events of our entire trip. I hope they find the statuette, but if they don't, the photograph and the inscription will be a treasure for me and for my family. Germany had some issues in dealing with World War II. The early period, there were many people who were part of that era who were still alive and still in important positions. And there was a great deal of denial, following orders. We didn't do it. We didn't know. And it turns out, and I was surprised by this, that the TV miniseries Holocaust had an enormous impact in Germany. It ended the era of taboo and started the period of discovery and healing. German education and observance of the Holocaust today is widespread. I don't have everything, but I want to bring out the fact that there are Holocaust memorials and museums and archives and documentation centers throughout Germany. The Holocaust Remembrance Day in Germany is January the 27th, commemorating the Auschwitz liberation. The Holocaust is taught in schools at almost all levels, in history and civics, religion, ethics, literature, and yearly they have a Kristallnacht, or Pogrom Day as it's called, their Remembrance Day. Every student is encouraged to visit a concentration camp, preservation of all Jewish cemeteries and synagogues and the like. And there's an interesting place in Berlin where they have all the anti-Jewish laws that were set up, each on a separate light pole throughout the plaza. They've criminalized certain behavior. A Nazi salute saying Heil you-know-who, wearing a swastika, and denying the Holocaust. Each of those could get a person 6 months in jail. Now, I've heard that there's some difficulty in knowing whether or not these laws are actually being followed, but there certainly are laws that are on the books. After that memorable time in Cologne, I went to Berlin because there were sites that I wanted to see. And I'll tell you that trying to see 4 Holocaust sites in a single day is a very, very bad idea. And if you should try to do that, you're going to need some kind of mood-boosting medication. I went to the Holocaust Memorial early in the morning. I'm interested in photography and I wanted to catch the morning light. And I was debating in my mind whether I liked it. I didn't like all these different blocks that give you the feeling of tombstones. They're arrayed in different heights. They're nice, neat rows. There's over 2,000 of them. And some are very tall and you're kind of dwarfed by them. Others are very short and you tower over them. And as I looked to take a final picture, I saw my shadow cast upon the top of one of these blocks. And suddenly it became a lot more memorable to me, a lot more meaningful that's me. I leave it to you and all the other experts to decide whether this is a good memorial or not. It has a lot of visitors, and if you go, don't miss the going underground to the museum that's below. I went to the Jewish Museum, and I recall these are statues. These are bronze shoes along the Danube River where Jews were shot and dumped into the water. I went to the, quote, new synagogue, which is a very old synagogue, and it was bombed out, and it was destroyed, and it was vandalized, so that what's left today is the entrance to that synagogue, but the synagogue itself is totally gone. It's just a vacant courtyard now. And I really got depressed when I saw this, a picture of the shadow of a Jewish star overlying the shadow of the shadow photograph of the synagogue. And I kind of got struck by the realization that what I see is not real. It is a synagogue, but it's not a practicing synagogue. It's a memorial. And I know that there's a Jewish community now, but I didn't go to that synagogue, and it left me very sad. Then I went to the Coup de Grace, which is the Topography of Terror Museum, which was the Gestapo headquarters in Berlin. Awesome place with an awesome collection of documentation and exhibits on how Hitler took over. It's really a place that you shouldn't miss should you go there, but I would go there first of the day and maybe go to a bar after that. The next day was a day of sunshine when I went to the Berlin German Resistance Memorial Center, and I recommend that to anybody and everybody. I learned more about the White Rose Resistance Organization, about the Red Orchestra, and the Edelweiss Pirates. I've never heard of any of that group, much less this next one, Chaluzi, which is a Jewish resistance organization, a pioneering circle. Their motto was, above all, be strong. And their flag is to the right, which is the Galilee Mountains are indicated in the background, and the tower in the middle symbolizes the group's aim, life in a kibbutz in Palestine. You can see the Hebrew writing above it. The whole third floor of this building is about Jewish resistance fighters and Gentiles who risked everything to help save Jews. It's one thing to think about the idea of trying to save a person, and it's altogether another to think about risking not only your life, but the lives of all the people you love if you're caught in that activity. And I find the bravery of these people is overwhelming. And my last stop was with this gentleman, Philip Holt. He's the director of several museums in Berlin, and we went to the Pappstrasse Museum, which was originally a military barracks. It's in the for a while it was set up as a prison for Jews and communists and others. It has limited hours of operation per week, but it's very important to me because this basement dungeon is where one of my relatives were taken. Gustav Horn, the younger of the two, was an aspiring young philosophy major and religious major in Berlin at the time of 1933-34. he was part of an organization that was attempting to teach young Jewish children how to be young adults how to become farmers so they could emigrate from Germany to Israel, to Palestine at the time. The reason that was necessary was Germany would only let them out if they could prove that they had the skills it would take to be of value to another country so that that other country would accept them. And so many of them, many of these schools were set up to teach farming, and they lived on the farms. And this group, part of this group was a man named Tietz, a doctor whose family was an extremely wealthy family at that time, and another was Wilfred Israel. This excerpt on the right comes from the book on Wilfred Israel by Naomi Shepherd, and in this particular segment, it discusses the capture of this small group of people. The squad burst into the room where Tietz and the others were sitting. Several of the Nazis were drunk, and one fired a shot into the ceiling. They accused the Jews of holding an illegal meeting. Cries of Heil Moscow, they said, had been heard outside. Give me a break. The standard pretext for summary arrest. The Jews were herded into trucks waiting in the street. Kuhn, who had the keys to Tietz's car, followed at a safe distance as they were driven away. So-and-so, a young lawyer who had consulted with Wilfred Israel frequently for help in his defense, his business, remembered being driven along the streets lined with cafes and terraces and seeing the faces of friends and customers along the way. The truck finally grew up to the General Pappstrasse barracks, at the time one of the most notorious sites of torture and murder in Berlin. The men were hustled out and pushed down the steps into the cellar. Tietz and Wilfred, who were both tall men, had to bend almost double to get through a low door, butted forward with kicks and blows. That night, my relative, Gustav Horn, was beaten, and in that beating, he took a blow to one ear, and he never heard out of that ear for the rest of his life. It was shortly thereafter, at the urging of his father, that he emigrated to Israel and helped another group of people in the establishment of Kibbutz Hazareah. Now, back to the talk about the Stolpersteins. So it requires having some basic information, because you can't put a stone outside of a residence if you can't find the residence, and most of us don't have that information readily available. We do need to find the legal name. If you can find the date of birth, either from death certificates or tombstones or whatever documentation you have, and the country of origin and maybe the city, that will help a great deal. When you don't have it, we need to find out where that was, and that can be difficult, and it can take years. I recommend that you have a separate sheet of paper, a flow sheet on each relative you wish to trace. And the number one place to go is the International Tracing Service, and this is the website for it. If you give them whatever you've got, you can also go to the website and gain a great deal of information. But if you give them whatever information you've got, it may take a little while, but they're going to do their best to provide you the documentation you want to have. Yad Vashem in Israel is another great resource, a parallel resource. Yad Vashem can plug into the International Tracing Service, and they will also help you. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial will also help you in trying to find as much information as is available, and it can be surprising how much is available and how little is available. As we know, the Einsatzgruppen's murder of Jews in small villages occurred in mass numbers throughout the Pale, and there you're not going to be able to find much information, though it's worth a search. In your hometown, you may find a university or a genealogy society that can help you, or a satellite through the Holocaust Memorial Library. They can help you with it. This is the kind of document that you might receive from and sometimes it's in German. In fact, it probably is always in German. And it's sometimes very hard to read. The photocopies are not necessarily the best. There are many genealogy websites, Ancestry.com, JewishGen, MyHeritage.com, 23andMe, Family Search, and I encourage you to Google some more. And what may not be there today is often there 6 months from now, as more and more documents are digitalized and made available on the web. So another way to go about getting this information is to just write to the city where you think your relatives lived or the last place that they lived. There could be a regional documentation center. You can address your letter to the local mayor, the city archive, or wherever. And outside of Germany, it may be necessary to contact Ann Thomas at the Stolpersteine website, but there are people who will help you. And so as I think back about a tombstone and a Stolperstein, a tombstone says, I was here, I lived, I died, I am in my place. A Stolperstein says, I am. I was here, I lived, I was murdered, but I am here in your place. As you walk down the street, that memorial is there. So, as Elie Wiesel said, to forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time. And as I walked away from that synagogue in Berlin, the new synagogue, if you will, I was a bit depressed. And then I saw the sign on the wall that says Kadima, forward, onward, and kind of took faith and moved forward. Now, the most challenging part of the talk. Can you rationally hate this child? To never forget and never forgive what happened in Germany at that time seems to me to be a very rational position. And never again is essential, is critical. But never again can also include irrational hate. That child is innocent as a newborn babe, even though he's at the great age of 4. I know so many people that still have issues with Germany and Germans of today. And I guess the point that I want to make from this is the Germany of yesterday that you would like to get even with is gone. The Germany of today is as guiltless as that little baby there. And I feel that to have hatred toward that baby indicates something deficient in the hater. It's an irrational behavior. And so I want to say thank you to you for listening to this presentation. And I want to thank all of these people that are present in this slide for their role in helping me with the journey of a lifetime that no way in the world will I ever have such a meaningful week in my life, since my marriage and honeymoon, that is. And I want to thank my wife for letting me go on this trip. And as I say, thank you all for listening. I hope that this talk has been helpful. Bye. If I can help you, this is my contact information.